Chris currently serves as the Technical Sales and Market Development Manager for the Emulsions and Craton Polymers Paving and Roofing Business Unit headquartered in Houston, Texas. He received his bachelor's in chemical engineering from Ohio University and a master's in chemical engineering from the University of Notre Dame. Chris has spent the last 14 years in the asphalt industry, primarily focused on polymer-modified emulsions and hot mix paving binders, as well as polymer-modified roofing membranes. He's an active member of AMAP, AI, EMA, and the various regional pavement preservation partnerships and the user-producer groups. And he is the co-chair of the National Emulsion Task Force. So, Chris?
Morning, everybody. Morning. I'm actually going to give a presentation. This is put together by Colin Franco, who is the chairman of the Emulsion Task Force. I believe he gave this at the AASHTO meeting in August, but I trimmed it down a little bit for our session now to give everybody an update on where we're at. So the Emulsion Task Force is actually incorporated under the Pavement Preservation Expert Task Group, which was established in 1991 by Jim Sorensen when he was leading the Office of Asset Management within FHWA. And this PPETG was really designed as an alternative, really as a counterpart to the binder ETG on the hot mix side to promote the concepts of pavement preservation. And as I mentioned, it's the parent group under which the Emulsion Task Force falls. Excuse me. And the FHWA PPETG has very specific, missions and goals, so to speak. And the idea is to advance and improve the state of the practice in the area of pavement preservation by working with federal, state, local agencies, industry, academia, and all the relevant stakeholders within the pavement preservation sector. Specifically, the goals are to provide acceptance and implementations by agencies of various pavement preservation treatments and applications, support preservation programs, work with the various stakeholders, support the preservation centers in particular, and to integrate pavement preservation into PMS systems, and asset management systems with the various agencies, state, federal, and local. We can go past that. And ultimately, as it relates to the Emulsion Task Force, the PPETG, sanctions and supports the Emulsion Task Force efforts, since the PPETG was incorporated and since the ETF has been doing work under the PPETG, MAP 21, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room are very familiar with, is now in place, and that officially recognizes pavement preservation. And the Foundation for Pavement Preservation had a lot to do with getting preservation recognized in the previous round of legislation. So that's all good work. So preservation's come a long way, since 1991 when the ETG was formed. So. And this is a chart that we've seen, a lot by many people in this room, but it really shows, performance enhancement through pavement preservation, looking at a pavement performance curve where the pavement condition index on the left is, as a function of time, shows when you would do various preservation treatments. And now, with MAP 21 in place, this is even more relevant, to what we're doing today in terms of how treatments are being measured, by the state and federal agencies in terms of funding and the like. So this, ultimately this type of graph provides the backdrop and all the support we need for preservation, and namely if you use these treatments at the right time when the pavement is in the, at a certain level of distress, they're a very good use of the taxpayer dollar and they will perform. So let's get into the ETF in particular. So the ETF has actually been around since I think 2008 or 2009, and it was actually formed by Jim Sorensen as well. So Jim's kind of the father of all this, the PPETG and the ETF. And the original mandate of the ETF underneath the PPETG was to really advance the effort to develop performance-based methods and specifications for emulsions in particular. Protocols for design, performance, inspection, acceptance, construction guides, best practices, et cetera. And in particular, one of the issues that was addressed when the ETF was specifically set up under the PPETG was the proliferation of all the different specifications that were out there for the various surface treatments by various agencies throughout the U.S. So one of the things I remember Jim talking about at one of the first or second meetings of this group was, we shouldn't have 50 different chip seal specifications for 50 different states. Even though there are different materials, there just shouldn't be this much proliferation of differentiation in specifications and practices with these products. So one of his other goals was to encourage the adoption of uniform national standards that would then flow through FHWA and in particular through AASHTO. The hot mix industry is, very well standardized within AASHTO at the agency level, but the emulsion industry really isn't. There's still a lot of, differences that are used in terms of specifying these products if you move from agency A to agency B at the state and local level. So the current membership from 2013 on, Todd mentioned Colin Franco, who's with the Rhode Island DOT, is the chair of the ETF. He's also very active within AASHTO, which was key for the chairman of this committee to be someone that could navigate within AASHTO. I work with Colin, and then we have members, as you'll see, from industry, academia, the DOTs, the FHWA, the National Center. We really tried to get a cross-section of all the various stakeholders in the emulsion industry so that as we developed these standards and practices for, submittal to AASHTO, that we could get buy-in from everyone that had a stake in how these products were spec'd and used. So within the ETF, then, we've set up, much like at the regional partnerships, we have working groups or subcommittees. Arlis Kadrimus from BASF is actually the chair of the Low Temperature Residue Recovery and Testing Subcommittee. And then Jim Moulthrop is here. He and Gary Hicks are chairs and co-chairs of the Mixture Emulsion Group, Design Group, and the Spray Emulsion Design Group. Todd Shields, who's chairing from Indiana DOT, who's chairing this session this morning, is the chair of the Supplier Certification and QA Subcommittee. Todd Thomas from COLAS, working with Steve Cross from ARRA, handles recycling emulsions. Darren Haslett from TxDOT is working, within the research subcommittee. And then in particular, if you look at how AASHTO specifications work, generally you have a material specification, a design practice, and then like a construction guideline for each system or application. And you'll reference different material specs from the design spec and from these other documents within AASHTO. It was a learning experience for me because I wasn't real familiar either until I started doing this. So we actually have a special working group with Mike Voth from the Central Federal Lands Office to coordinate in particular the emulsion material and the emulsion residue specifications between all the design specifications for the various applications. So you'll see a little more as we go forward how this works, but we're set up, I think, pretty well to address what we need within AASHTO and to have a cross-reference of all the stakeholders and all the various committees and in leadership positions. So the added tasks, I guess, that where we are now from 2013 to now is to develop performance specifications for adoption by AASHTO for all emulsion treatments and uses in pavement preservation, and then work with the FHWA PPETG to facilitate adoption of these treatments. So, working with the PPETG, once the specifications were approved and moved into AASHTO to get the word out, throughout the states, and local agencies. We also, will be, having these discussions at the partnerships. They're ideal for this kind of message too. Once these specs are in place within AASHTO. So, as I mentioned, the ETF was formed in 2000. I think it was 2008. And then work commenced in the original ETF from 2008, 2009 through 2011, and there was some work done at that time, but then in 2011, based on some reorganizations that were going on within FHWA and in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, the PPETG was really kind of put on hold. So there was a lag between 2011, May of 2011, and then July of 2013 when there really wasn't anything done because of the hiatus of the PPETG within Federal Highway. And in that time, from 2008 to 2011, probably the biggest thing that the ETF did and promoted was the conversion or adoption of the low temperature residue recovery method within from ASTM into AASHTO. So now there's an AASHTO method in place that the agencies can reference for recovering residue by low temperature. One of the early action items that was also discussed, in addition to developing performance-based standards and uniform standards within AASHTO for emulsion treatments in the U.S., was the idea that it's not in the field. It doesn't happen that an emulsion is subjected to 350 or 400 Fahrenheit temperatures when it's recovered on the road. It's just we're subjecting the material to a treatment to drive the water off that will potentially provide, material properties that aren't indicative of what you would get on the road. It's more a matter of convenience and timing to release material in the plants that we do this. So, there's been a lot of work for a number of years trying to come up with a way to recover an emulsion at a reasonable temperature under a reasonable set of conditions. It's more typical of what you would get on a road that won't take 2 days or 24 hours or something like that. So there actually are methods out there now within ASTM and AASHTO for recovering an emulsion residue at lower temperature. In 6 hours, Jerry Ranke and at Matthey Services has actually worked on a vacuum version of this same recovery method that brings the time down to 3 hours. So we're really getting close to a low temperature method that people are getting comfortable with, and the statistics are being generated that could actually be used by a producer or an agency to do release testing and these kinds of things. So that's probably the biggest accomplishment we had in those first couple years. But then in the summer of 2013, Colin and Larry and others wanted to get this effort going again, independent of the PPETG, which was being reorganized within FHWA. So we all met in Rhode Island at their offices and came up with a new organizational structure, and then with our goals and objectives moving forward from then up until now. So essentially, we reaffirmed what Jim's original intent was with forming the ETF, which was to develop performance-based specs and encourage adoption of uniform standards, and in particular to focus on developing AASHTO standards. AASHTO was really key in all this because AASHTO is obviously the specifying body or the governing body that's used predominantly on the hot mix side, that has wide-scale adoption by agencies across the U.S. If you look at binder testing of hot mix binders, because we just recently looked at this for some of the work we're doing at Kraton, virtually all the state agencies use AASHTO. I mean, there's a few that use ASTM, but essentially AASHTO is the law of the land when it comes to material specifications, design practices, best practices for the hot mix industry. So at any rate, the focus was on AASHTO, to develop these material specs, design practices, guide specs. We reset the structure, got more stakeholders involved, made sure we had representation from EMA, ARA, ISA, the Asphalt Institute, the various industry organizations. We had a cross-reference of contractors, emulsion producers, state agency reps, federal reps. So we felt like we were pretty well set. And in the meantime, we also made a list of all the preservation treatments that or emulsion treatments that we wanted to address within the ETF itself in terms of developing these specifications for AASHTO. And you'll see the list here. That's a pretty extensive list, but we've made pretty good progress in the last 2 years, as you'll see as we finish up. But we've covered chip seal, micro, tack coat, fog seal, slurry seal, and cold in place recycling as of now, in terms of drafting material specs, design practices, and the other documents within AASHTO format for submittal to the subcommittee on materials or the subcommittee on maintenance, et cetera. So one of the biggest things that we had to do initially was, and from a strategic standpoint within AASHTO, it's always a little bit easier to work with an existing accepted AASHTO standard than it is to get a new one in provisionally and then officially adopted. Okay, so if you look at within AASHTO in terms of the emulsion itself, there are basically 3 AASHTO specifications for anionic, cationic emulsions, and then polymer modified cationic emulsions, which are M140, M208, and M316. And there are several states that use these specifications either individually or all 3 of them. Some states are will reference these. Some don't reference the AASHTO specs at all. If you go to the Asphalt Institute website, they actually have a excuse me, a database for hot mix binder specs, and they now have an emulsion spec database for all 50 states. So you can go right now to the AI website and look up in the state of Kansas, here's their hot mix binder specs, and here is all the specs they have for emulsion treatments. And the thing to note is that the binder specification, hot mix binder specifications for a state are generally, it's a much shorter document than the emulsion specs. It took a long time to get the emulsion specs out there through the AI database. And the reason that is because there's so many different types of emulsions and there's so many different ways that the states specify them. So they really kind of brought home this idea that we really need to be trying to normalize this somewhat, again, to help agencies feel more comfortable adopting these treatments across the U.S. or in areas, where, I'm sure, you heard, some of the presentations, well, we don't do micro because we had issues with it, or we don't do this treatment because it's something that happened in the past. And by standardizing all these specifications and trying to, encourage adoption within one body like, say, AASHTO, it gives credibility to these treatments, within the industry and within the agencies themselves. So what we did was we updated M140, M208, and M316 within the special working group so that these could be referenced in the design specs that the subcommittees were working on for all these treatments. So if you get into the details, you'll see that, okay, you have a material specification and then you have a design practice for chip seal or micro, and in the design practice, it has to reference the material spec. So it'll say, reference AASHTO M316 for the emulsion types and properties to be used in microsurfacing or in chip seal. And there hadn't been a significant update to any of these emulsion specifications within AASHTO for many, many years. If you went back, they'd have minor changes, but they had essentially been in AASHTO in the format that they're in for decades. So we did a lot of cleanup, and we also added in some of the newer emulsions that have been used, in the last few years. Cationic high float emulsions, a couple anionic high float grades actually that weren't in there, polymer modified tack coats. There were microsurfacing grades weren't even in, in AASHTO format at this time. So that was a big effort, but these specifications are at the AASHTO subcommittee on materials. They've been reviewed, and they're going to probably be published, at least from what I understand, in the 2016 book. So that's a big update, and took 2 years to get it done, but we're almost there. Microsurfacing was the first emulsion treatment that we tackled really within the ETF. Back in that meeting in Rhode Island in 2013, that was the one that everyone said, hey, we need to start with this because we're having a lot of comments from the field in various areas about problems. Let's see if we can work on that first. So as of now, we have the materials for microsurfacing, the design practice, the best practice document, and the construction guide spec are all completed for this from Jim and Gary's subcommittee for the mixed design. The same with the chip seal. And if you'll see on here that down here for construction guide spec, it says AASHTO or FHWA. We're still trying to figure out how within AASHTO where we route these documents. There's some confusion about where these guide specs go, and and if there's a champion there within AASHTO within their subcommittee on maintenance, or the subcommittee of, I believe it's called subcommittee on construction or something like that. So we work primarily in the subcommittee on materials, but we develop documents that have to go to other subcommittees. And then there's actually some best practices documents we have. I think that the plan is to submit those through FHWA for tech briefs that can be downloaded, et cetera, by the agencies. Slurry seals, so chip seal and micro were the first two treatments that we spent a lot of time on and really got our process down as to how to draft these documents. I mean, it was really there were very few people that really understood how AASHTO worked. Colin was one of them, Mike Voth was another one, there were a few other people, but myself included, there were several that, this learning how to draft an AASHTO document and the procedures and processes of how this worked was a real eye-opener, to say the least. Slurry seals, Jim and Gary's group are about halfway through drafting all the documents for slurry seal, fog seals. And again, from a practical standpoint, you have a material spec, you have a design practice, and then really kind of a construction guide spec, as they call it, within AASHTO. So these are extensive, amounts of effort. Also, probably, something that one of the areas where there's really not a lot of standardization, not even within AASHTO, but even within the states. Like if you look at a chip seal spec in state A versus state B, you can find some similarities. But once you get into some of the recycling applications, it kind of goes out the door. And so this is something that I'm really happy about. Todd Thomas, he's not here, but I think there's representatives from Colas here. Todd is with Colas Solutions out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and he spearheaded the effort to try to standardize a material specification design practice for CIR, cold in place recycling. That's kind of the first one we tackled, and they've recently completed that material spec and the design practice, and we've submitted those to AASHTO for consideration, and that's a very big accomplishment if you look at the coordination between our group and then the ARRA, who was also doing something in parallel. So we're making progress. So next steps. In the short term, we're going to complete drafting of AASHTO standards for the rest of the treatments we showed that we haven't addressed yet. And really, Colin, his big focus now, and there's been a lot of discussion at this partnership meeting, to focus next on basically quality control and quality assurance for emulsion treatments. In particular, starting with like we did for the AASHTO methods and practices effort, to start there for microsurfacing and chip seal applications, since those are the two main treatments that we really kind of talk about initially when we have these discussions. That's the ones that come up always. Well, we need to work on chip seal and micro. And also within research, we also are working on putting together research statements and submitting proposals to NCHRP to fund research as well. That's one of the things that Jim Sorensen was really big on, was getting the preservation research roadmap in place. So we're working in that area as well. And as originally stated in our objectives as the ETF under the PPETG, to promote emulsion technologies back up through the FHWA expert task group research. And in particular, if you look at what we've done so far, if you look at the documents that we submitted in AASHTO for M208, M140, and M316, we basically have incorporated the temperature dependence of asphalt on the residue properties. So if you look at like a chip seal specification currently, there's a pin range generally on the residue, and it's 90 to 250, right? So what we've done is incorporated various pin ranges that we've correlated with research that's been done with various asphalt sources via LTPP bind that they use for super pave within AASHTO. And so with now these material specs at least have penetration ranges, and they've been consolidated so you don't have a proliferation of plus type tests on a single surface treatment and or residue. So as you move towards this type of approach with the temperature susceptibility of the asphalt in the emulsion material spec, the next logical step then from there is to then move towards rheological based evaluation of the residue, where you use something like a super pave principle. It doesn't have to be super pave, but it would be something more rheologically based than a single penetration measurement, let's say, or a single softening point measurement. It would be something you could run on a DSR. So from a 30,000 foot view, we're trying to move towards low temperature recovery of the residue in a reasonable amount of time that an emulsion producer could use in practice at their plants based on their tanks and the sizes and the amount of material they make, and then taking that low temperature residue, which would be typical of how it would cure in the field, and testing smaller quantities in shorter times using something like a rheometer. Now, what that ultimate performance-based spec might look like is going to take a while, but we had to do the cleanup work and get these documents into AASHTO first and start moving in that direction. You'd call it like phase one. Okay. So the last really, you guys are already talking about this, but the last focus is really for this year, for the rest of this year and into next year, as I mentioned, is QA/QC. And I know that Larry talks about it a lot and the partnerships talk about it a lot. But we're going to be spending a lot more time in the next 6 months to a year, I think, within the ETF in this area. And we have, the task force has got a whole list of items that I won't go through here as to what we need to address, going forward for that part of the effort. But hopefully we'll have, next year at the national meeting, we'll be able to report out on some of the advancements in QC/QA that we've been working on in terms of documents, trainings, and all that kind of stuff. And lastly, and I'll finish up, is the PPETG has actually been reformed finally. So the last meeting was in May of 2011, and then there was basically a little over a 4-year hiatus. But the PPETG now has just had its first re-meeting or re-inauguration in Washington, D.C. In September. So we're now kind of getting back on track, so to speak, in terms of the formal, organizational structure under the ETG, and so we're going to continue our efforts along that line and go forward. So with that, I'll finish up, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. And if not, thank you.